Hello and welcome to a silly season edition of the Inside Line. I'm here with my co-host Joey Barnes. I'm Nathan Brown, your Motorsports insider with the Indianapolis Star, and we are here to talk about what has been a really crazy 24, 48 hours and really crazy last couple of weeks here in IndyCar Silly season landscape that I would say a month ago felt like it was going to be pretty calm and potentially have really very little impactful action into what this grid was going to look like here in 2026 before this, big chessboard full of open seats and drivers that we expect to, unfold here in the next 10 to 12 months. And then things kind of got off the rails here. To set the stage in case you've been living under a rock, we have Will Power at a new team for the first time in 17 years. He leaves the Team Penske on his own accord. We'll get into all that here in just a little bit. Arriving at Andretti Global to replace Colton Herta, who is, as we know now, definitely going to spend 2026 as Cadillac F1's first testing and development driver. We have no word yet on what he might be doing from a racing standpoint. We expect that he will end up in Formula 2, but that is yet to be confirmed, and we will hopefully hear about that here in the coming weeks. To break all of this down and talk about kind of where the table stands now, what drivers and seats are still available, here with my co-host Joey Barnes. Joey, it's been I think one of the crazier couple day stretches of silly season. Now, granted, a lot of this seemed like it was pretty set in stone once we got the checkered flag in Nashville, but there were still those questions of, is Team Penske really going to let Will Power go? Is Will Power really going to walk away from Team Penske? Is Colton really going to decide to give up his ride in IndyCar that in a great year can contend for race wins and poles and championships and potentially an Indy 500 and go follow his dreams to the European racing world and hopefully eventually Formula One. We get to this point here on Thursday morning where all of this has now taken place. What has been the biggest surprise from your standpoint when you look at all of the puzzle pieces and the decisions that have had to be made and where this is all settled now?
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff. I mean, we've been anticipating 2026 to be the crazy one, and it still could be. But 2025 said, "Hold my beer," and we've got all these different moves in a very short amount of time, right as the season ended. Nothing like starting a 6-month off season with a bunch of news. But for me, it's got to be the Will Power Penske split. I mean, you're talking about 17 years, 42 wins together. You're talking about two championships, an Indy 500, and in many ways, because of his flair and his personality, even with that, he still was for Penske kind of the good soldier, right? Like he was still there to do everything that he was supposed to do, anything that the team needed. He's very selfless in that respect. And, so to go through and for me, I've always kind of viewed Will as the heartbeat of that team. I mean, even through the LEO situation where Will first stood in, we're talking about Will having a fractured back early in his career too, that he had to deal with. And there's so many different things that he pushed through to help push that team forward. And obviously cemented a place for himself within the sport to let somebody like that walk. I've said this numerous times. I'll continue to say it. In my mind, there's only 2 drivers in the series right now that deserve to go out on their own terms. And one is Scott Dixon and the other is Will Power. Well, Alex Plough's getting there if he continues this stuff, but for what they've meant to the sport and the fact that especially in Will's case, I mean, Scott obviously does this too, so I don't want to discount that, but just focusing on Will for a second, Will showed you everything that he could possibly show you, that he is still capable of winning races, that he's still capable of being a championship challenger, and during the Alex Palou era, he is the only person at Alex Palou era at Ganassi. He is the only person to win a championship against him. So in many ways, I'm stunned at I got to be careful how I say this to some degree. The optics to me come across as disrespect. Like the optics of how this has played out comes across as disrespect. Some of the learnings that have since come out with how the process was, how in many ways willing they were to give Will up. Go look for a ride. Go do this. Like, we're not going to give you a 3-year deal. We're going to give you a 1-year deal. Like there's just so many elements of that is like, how do you do this? And look, David Malukas is a very fine race car driver. He's yet to be confirmed for that ride. I'll just clarify that right now, but that's kind of where the needle's been pointing now for the better part of over a season. He's a fine race car driver. I'm sure he's going to go on and win races, especially if he gets announced for that Penske seat. I've got no doubt he'll win races. In so many ways, when you look at the resumes, and I know you're not going to be able to, Malukas hasn't had enough time like Will has to build a resume like that. But at the same time, like there's a reason that you put Joseph in that seat when you put Joseph in that seat. There's a reason why you put Simon in the seat when you had Simon Pagenaud come over. He had to win races at Schmidt-Peterson first. Joseph had to win races at Carpenter Racing first. David Malukas hasn't. He's got a few podiums. That's literally it. And I don't know if this is just easier because there's a little bit of how do I say this? Kind of the personality, the outgoingness. If this is more of a PR shtick to help things, because we know how affable that Malukas is. And, equally kind of stunned at where Verizon kind of sits in all this. Will's longtime sponsor for that. I mean, obviously we saw a video clip on Instagram that the CEO of Verizon released thanking Will for all the time together and all their successes together. And Verizon being a Team Penske sponsorship, not a driver sponsorship in this situation. There's just so many different elements of it that I'm just kind of baffled by. And I'm like, okay, so like, is Verizon going to be David Malukas' sponsor? Is Verizon going to move to a different car? Like, because, I mean, in some ways it makes sense to have a young kid in a car sponsored by a phone company because, the age that we're in. But yeah, there's just to kind of bring it full circle. It just comes across as disrespectful to me. And Will's going to find, what Team Penske gave away. I mean, it wasn't even like, hey, we're trading such and such for such and such. You're giving away knowledge. You're giving away insight. And you know what? You wanted to completely just change things at your team. In many ways, I don't recognize this Team Penske. Like Tim Cindric's gone. Rzuski's gone. Kyle Moyer's at Arrow McLaren now. Will's gone. I've got to wonder how much of that infrastructure. I mean, Dave Festino and Will are extremely close. I mean, does Dave go with Will eventually? Like, how does the dynamics of this team completely change because of all this? I mean, you want to change whatever you had wasn't good enough, but we know how close you were when you had all these pieces. And obviously there was a couple of scandals associated with it, but nonetheless, you were trying to hit a threshold. And right now, I would argue you were lucky to win 2 races this year. I mean, one for sure, Will did not luck into that win, to be fair. The events that played out in Nashville were kind of unique in their own respects, but it was a miserable season for Penske as a whole. So the fact that they're just completely doing this kind of baffles me. And, one last point that I want to make, because I know I'm rambling here, is this. It's not as simple as Team Penske to Andretti Global. It's and this is the wild thing. As the lineups look now, with several unconfirmed entries, Chevy has 2 Indy 500 winners, 3 total Indy 500s, and that's Joseph Newgarden and Alexander Rossi. They only have 2 championships. Both belong to Joseph Newgarden. Honda, at the moment, has Will Power, Marcus Ericsson, Scott Dixon, and Alex Palou as your Indy 5. Well, and if you want to tack on Elio Castroneves, that's for an Indy one-off. That's a combined 8 Indy 500 victories. You look at the champions. Now you've got Power with 2, Dixon with 6, Palou with 4. You can math that into 12 right there. I mean, it's very much, and this is a manufacturer that just stormed through the season, and we wondered if they were going to sweep every single race at one point during the middle of the year. This is a very interesting dynamic for what this does also to the manufacturer situation, I think, and the amount of data. And Will Power was already bad fast on street circuits, and Andretti's been known to have the best street circuit damper program there is. This is going to be interesting moving forward, and it's going to be a hell of a lot of fun to watch. And in some ways, I think it's the Will Power revenge tour. I think back to that line he said when he won his Indy 500 that we all love. That's probably not a phrase we could use on the podcast, but something to the effect of "show me respect," and I'll let you fill in the blanks with the following one.
But Mother Truckers is probably the PG version of that. You guys can make the connection.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a very, very similar thing after this.
Yeah, you mentioned the respect factor in all this, and that was something that I wrote on because on Tuesday afternoon and evening, because I really felt like that was the prevailing theme in all of this. As I started to learn more just about how this process unfolded, and it's things that others have learned too. David Mulcher wrote a great piece on racer.com. I encourage folks to go read if you haven't already. There are things that I learned from just being on the ground at Nashville Super Speedway this weekend, and have since learned just about this whole back and forth process, and with Will, and how ultimately this really was his decision to leave Team Penske. He gave a great interview on Off Track with Hinch and Rossi, James Hinchcliffe, and Alexander Rossi's podcast that I encourage folks to go and listen to after this if you haven't yet. And it boils down to a couple year saga here recently where Will ultimately felt like he wasn't getting the respect that he deserved, particularly after he went and won the team's most recent championship in 2022. Yes, he only won one race that year, but he earned that championship. Joseph Newgarden, I think, won 5 races that year. And, when you think of that, should have been the guy that was hoisting the Astor Cup. And yet he was in a position in that season finale where he was going to have to beat Will by a considerable number of points, for all intents and purposes, have to go and win a 6th race just to beat a guy who won one race. Ultimately, Joseph goes and finishes runner-up in that finale. Will finishes 3rd, and Will is the champion after that year. If memory serves me right, he had 1 year left on his contract that he had signed, and that offseason, he and then Team Penske president over the entire organization, Tim Cindric, sat down, and Will had been pining for a 3-year deal, ultimately got a 2-year deal. But Tim, according to Will, and he's now said this publicly, I'd heard about this privately a couple weeks back, had said, hey, this is where we landed, 2-year deal, but we will talk to you after 2024. And as long as you are continuing to perform, we're going to want to keep you around. 2023 goes as it does for Will, a horrific year. Worse, certainly much worse off the track than it was on, but it was a tough year for him. We all know the trials and tribulations that Will and that entire Power family was going through. His wife, Liz, nearly died a couple times, I think, in a span of a few months with a really intense staph infection and the lingering effects that came from that. And Will was, in a race car on race weekends, deciding if he should even be doing that. The risks of, potentially he and his wife possibly perishing and leaving their son Bo without parents really weighed heavily on him. But he gets through that. I think finishes like seventh in the championship. Incredibly respectable given what we learn and what we know he was going through, and then comes back, bounces back, and in 2024. You and I were talking off pod about the ways in which that championship ultimately got away from him, but he was the only driver alive when we got to that season finale in Nashville a year ago that could potentially overtake Alex Palou. He'd won more races than Alex. He had more podium finishes than Alex. Ultimately, it was Alex's consistency and that team's consistency and the lack of mistakes that they made that helped Alex win that championship. But you think back to the ways in which that season, kind of got away from them between, the crash in the last few laps at Worldwide Technology Raceway that ultimately was caused by some, interesting restart procedures from Will's teammate, Joseph Newgarden. Will's maybe overly aggressive choice on where he attempted to try and pass his teammate, Scott McLaughlin, to pick up one spot at Toronto that, probably cost him 10 or 15, probably 15 points at that stage in the race. He spins in race 2 at Milwaukee on a day in which Palou, didn't start the first 20 or 25 laps because of a mechanical issue. Will could probably finish, a guaranteed top 5, maybe a podium, and instead he finishes 10th. And, ultimately he then drops down to 4th in the championship because he has his seatbelt malfunction in the season finale, and Colton Herta and Scott McLaughlin pass him. But for all intents and purposes, he put together, one of, if not, you could argue at its highs, maybe the best performance that year in a championship, and ultimately is beat out by a guy who just was more consistent. And he finishes 4th. He's expecting to sit down with Tim Cindric in those winter months, and the phone call never comes. And so he goes out and hires Oriol Servia, A14 management, founded and run by Fernando Alonso, and comes into the season guns blazing with now finally for the first time someone to represent him at the negotiating table. He talked, I think, yesterday on that podcast with James and Alex about how, in the past he would pretty much go whenever there was a new contract to be negotiated, he would ask Team Penske, what do you want to pay me? What do you think I'm worth? And that was kind of just how they hashed it out. He was, really respectable. He'd always been the consummate team guy, and goes and wins 3 races, finishes on the podium 7 times, numbers that were only matched by his teammate Scott McLaughlin, and goes into this year without a contract. He said, I think multiple times, no one else would have gone into a contract year. That would have been taken care of if anyone else on the grid had been in my position. And ultimately he wasn't. Tim said that they would talk after the 500. Ultimately, Tim doesn't even make it past the 500. He gets fired. And ultimately he and Roger sit down after Detroit, and rather taking care of all of this, Roger tells him that he gives him the freedom that I don't think necessarily was in his contract to go and seek out what other opportunities might be out there, because Team Penske wasn't willing to make a decision at that point. Will said in that podcast, he, coming into May, he would have accepted a 1-year deal, which I thought was really revealing, because we had this assumption for months and months now that ultimately Will was looking for a 2-year deal, and Team Penske was only maybe willing to give him 1 year so as to best set them up for, again, that crazy silly season that we're expecting here at the end of the 2026 campaign. Will said yesterday he would have taken a 1-year deal in May, but that never came. And so ultimately he tells the story of walking up to Dan Towriss at Road America and telling Dan, I want to drive for you. And that then gets the wheels turning in Dan's mind. Dan, who has been through this entire F1 saga with Michael Andretti and Colton Herta, and has seen how close Colton has gotten the last couple years without any opportunities truly matriculating. And Dan said in that interview with James and Alex that he'd had some thoughts about, what is it going to take to truly set Colton up for success if he truly wants this F1 opportunity, which Colton has said. I think there's some fans out there that misremember this or have misheard this, but Formula One has always been Colton Herta's dream. He has been really happy in IndyCar. His dad raced in IndyCar. He grew up around the sport, but F1 has been where Colton has ultimately wanted to get to. And that was another thing that stood out in that podcast interview yesterday, that he made very clear. F1, he has said it would be a tough decision to leave, but ultimately F1 is where he wanted to be. And so that conversation with Will ultimately is what prompted Dan Towriss to sit down with Colton and propose this, wacky idea to leave IndyCar, go potentially be a test driver in F1. And it hasn't been confirmed, but Dan did say it on the podcast that he is going to be in Formula 2. Colton is going to be in Formula 2 next year. We don't know yet with what team. But that's the plan. And ultimately this was something where Colton was going to have to, take this tough road. It wasn't going to be easy. This whole Cadillac F1 program has not come on a non-bumpy path. And if Colton wanted to pursue his dream, ultimately, he was given a golden ticket and said, take this if you want it. If you don't, we understand. But it is now or never. And ultimately, Colton mulls over that decision, really only makes it within the last couple days. And that then is what opens the door for the potential to sign Will. Will also talks about after Portland, he gets a text message from Roger Penske a couple days after saying, not so much congratulations, but boy, Will, this really this really plays out well for you in your in your position of trying to get an extension from us. And I don't exactly know when or how this was communicated, but they either were going to or did in fact offer Will a 1-year deal, and they wanted to fly Will out in that that off time between Portland and Milwaukee. Wanted to fly him out. He lives in Mooresville, to Detroit, to Penske Corp headquarters, and sit down with Roger and finally have that true first discussion about whether they stick around with each other for another year. And it was in that moment, Will talks about with that offer to have the Penske Corp private jet flown out there to bring him to Detroit, that he had this realization and for the first time actually said out loud, no, I'm not coming back. And that's essentially what has led to where we are now. He still, I do think, did talk to Roger after Nashville, probably just as a gut check to make sure that they were both on the same page, but ultimately nothing had changed. And Will did, in fact, make this decision to move on. I know some folks were caught off guard seeing that in that press release, in the social posts on Tuesday morning when this news did finally break and get confirmed. Felt like it was the team shouldering Will with the, if you want to say blame, but ultimately I think it was true. This was Will's decision. Ultimately, I think he was compelled and pushed toward it by a lack of respect for someone who had given his all to this organization for 17 years. I don't think this would have been Will's decision had this process played out and been handled differently, but this is ultimately this was the hand he was dealt, and he reacted accordingly. And now he's in a seat and at an organization that continues to feel like it's on the rise. He's, as you mentioned, got a great opportunity to win street races. I think he's immediately that team's most accomplished, best oval racer. And he, I think, also brings a real level of tenacity on road courses that this team has talked about, in these last couple of weeks, talking to Colton, talking to Marcus and Kyle. before the season finale. Road courses are where they think they really need to make gains to be able to attack Chip Ganassi Racing and Alex Palou for a championship. And I think, we look at some of the places where Will has won recently. Portland a couple times is an example. He's run well at Laguna. He's run well at the IMS road course. That hasn't always been very great for that team. And I think that's something else that Will can bring to this organization. He'd been a Chevy driver since Chevy came back into the sport in 2012, and now is a Honda driver. You've got to, if you're in that HRC US camp, if you're David Salters, you've got to love the way that lineup is stacking up for next season and beyond, if they are in the sport beyond next year.
Yeah, and I think I've only got a couple more points before we talk a little bit more on the Colton stuff, but one is one of the more underrated things with Will that a lot of people maybe don't get to see or don't pick up on because they just see kind of his outgoing, like his outbursts at times, or sometimes his, some people look at it as like an airheadedness because he just seems like he's always spaced out a little bit. But, I think back to post, I think it was a post practice or a post qualifying media at Long Beach in pre-2020, and he just kind of looked spaced out. And he was asked in that session by I want to say it was a member of Trackside Online in that media bit of just, you seem like you're here, but you're not here. And he goes, "Yeah, I'm not here." And he started drifting off about talking about he's thinking about the car and he's thinking about different changes and alterations. His level of just understanding with different engineering elements of the car in terms of how to communicate that to the engineer is so underrated. And the things that he's going to be able to give that are with that to Andretti, I think you hit the nail on the head with the road course package. I think the amount of mechanical grip that they could see an increase in is going to be mega. And maybe they're able to get closer to where Chip Ganassi Racing is right now as far as that mechanical grip goes and things like that. So that's going to be incredibly interesting. The other thing I want to hit on the timeline just briefly with what you were talking about, which is this. What happened in May? Everybody knows before the season, David Malukas became an AJ Foyt Racing driver in an alliance with Team Penske. And he was going to be given the favorable Team Penske engineer in waiting, if you will, that was being cast off to AJ Foyt Racing for
James Snable, for those who don't know.
And they did he did good things with Santino a year ago, and top 10 in the championship, etc. And Ferrucci has to deal with another new engineer, and they give Snable to Malukas, and we see Malukas finish third on track in the Indy 500 after the Ericsson disqualification, rose to second. That's in May. That's around the time frame that this stuff was happening with Will, and everything was quiet, and he was free to look around. Then you start to look at how the rest of the season played out for Malukas, the crashes, the incidents, the qualifying really well, but not able to maintain it. And this is still with Snable on top of the timing stand, mind you. And then you see how all of this is playing out, and it's almost as if I'm paraphrasing here, but this is how my mind works. It's almost as if Penske started to look at what they were about to deal with, and they looked at the speed that Will still possesses, and just it immediately was like, oh shit, we've got to figure out how to cover ourselves for this next year, because maybe David isn't ready, and maybe we do need Will for one more season. And because of you disrespected him earlier in the season, you lost that chance. And ultimately, I didn't see where it would have been bad to negotiate this with Will beforehand, because here's the thing. If you also are looking at Joseph Newgarden's contract ending in 2026, and you extend Will to the end of 2026, and potentially you have two seats, the odds of retaining one of them are high. But also, why couldn't you get an additional year out of Malukas, who, not even 25 years old right now, right? So it's just a situation where it was so mishandled and so just it baffles me on how everything has come to light. The time frame in which this transpired, what Will described on the podcast and things like that, a lot of things make sense when you start to just look at the results that Malukas was having and you start to look at the results that Power was getting. They kind of crisscrossed midsummer, obviously, because we know about how horrendous the season was for Team Penske. So, but you don't know how good you got it till it's gone. And I certainly think that Team Penske is going to miss him for a number of reasons. And, this is going to really put the ball in Penske's court. I mean, maybe they did it out of respect for Will, or maybe they don't know the plan. Maybe they're going to continue to push forward with the original plan. But David Malukas not being announced yet, and hearing that there was potential for a 1-year extension, which would have kept David in the 4 car at AJ Foyt Racing, presumably, you're looking at this going, how are they going to move him up? Are they going to fill it with a veteran? Like, what do they do here? Because clearly they were willing to do something for Will to identify 2026 and maybe grow David a little bit more. And keep in mind also growing Miles Rowe, who is part of the development program pipeline, 1 more year in Indy next after having 2 wins this past year in his sophomore campaign. So, those are the things that kind of speak to me a little bit whenever I look at the timeline, and that's just kind of how I identify it.
It is interesting to hear Will talk about that, about how, ultimately he was, literally just a couple of weeks ago, less than a month ago, was offered, an opportunity to come back. When, this is before my time, but when Montoya ultimately finished his last full season in 2016, I think he finished 8th in the championship. Joseph Newgarden had won races the past 2 seasons. He finished 4th in 2016. I wasn't around that time, but I feel confident in saying, Montoya wasn't offered a 1-year deal, and adding Joseph wasn't, the backup plan. I'm guessing, it was a pretty clear cut decision. They knew pretty early on that, it happened to line up well. Montoya's contract was going to end in 16. Joseph's was going to end in 16. And that seemed like it was a pretty well lined up thing, cut and dry, no real hard decision. The fact that, this ultimately, I think this comes across to me, I think it was a mistake to not engage Will last offseason, but I think there's a lot to, and you talk to people in the paddock, and there are a lot of people that believe that Tim Cindric was, the real big proponent behind this David Malukas signing. The one that, kind of helped organize and ultimately strike whatever the deal was that David signed, back late last summer, when ultimately he became, in some way connected to Team Penske and the Penske organization that helped him, land that ride at AJ Foyt Racing, who was their, technical partner. And the fact that Tim made that promise to Will, and then, before Malukas came into the fray, and then wasn't willing to sit down and do that at a moment where I think Will is right. I think anyone who had won 3 races the year before and had probably been, at minimum the second best car throughout the whole year, if you take away that last race and how it unfolded for Will, any other person would have gotten an extension right then and there. I mean, the team did the same thing for McLaughlin, who had the same number of wins and the same number of podiums as Will did. McLaughlin got an extension figured out that he announced at the season opener this year. So he told us at that moment in St. Pete that 2025 was not a contract year for him. So he was going to be here through at least 2026. And the team still put an extension on the table for him, and he just got some additional job security. So he, they were willing to sign Scott up for a lot longer time. Now, granted, Will is, I don't have their exact ages, but I think Will's probably
44.
I know Will's 44. I don't exactly know how McLaughlin is. He's probably 15-ish years younger than Will, if I were to
31,
guess.
32, something like that.
Okay, yeah, so definitely more than 10, between 10 and 15 years younger than Will. So yes, they're on different timelines in their
But
in trajectories in their careers, but the fact that Will wasn't engaged, until Tim kind of flipped the tables on him and said, "Hey, we'll talk after May," really gives me the impression that he was a big proponent of this whole David thing. And then when Tim gets fired and there's kind of this vacuum in, from a leadership standpoint in that organization, that kind of tells me or indicates to me that, and I don't blame Roger to some extent, but there's so many fires to put out. Will's extension feels like it kind of just got put on the back burner. I mean, Roger had to deal with the public perceptions, of the series, dealing with what happened with his team and the connections to the series, and his point in some people calling into question his conflicts of interest, the idea that they had to go and start putting the pieces together for this independent officiating board that still has not been formally announced, but really was, really sparked, I think, and really put into motion, if you will, after what happened in the month of May, the things that they were trying to figure out for next year's schedule, the development of this new car, all of these things being put on Roger Penske and his exec team's plate at that moment. And it really just kind of feels like they, for better or worse, Will and hashing out his contract just wasn't really the top priority. And they kind of just said, we need to put these other fires out first. We need to get our new leadership structure for this organization put in there. Another one of those major things that Roger had to tackle. And ultimately, we're going to get to talking with Will when we get to it, and discounted the way in which that was going to irk a driver who was already frustrated when he got to the month of May. And you give a driver like Will Power the opportunity to go and test the market, and these are the types of things that happen. I'm sure Will and Oriole had a sense, maybe in some way, that this was something that was out there for Colton, and that this Andretti thing was a real possibility, probably around the same time that Roger finally felt comfortable bringing Will to the negotiating table. And then the way in which Roger approached that from a tact standpoint, I think, was probably rubbed Will the wrong way, rightly so. It wasn't from the way at least Will tells the story, it wasn't, hey, congratulations on this victory. The team did such a, you and the team, that, this was such an important win for this program and what has been a tough year. It was just, man, this really helps out your negotiation side on, in the boardroom. And I think that rubbed Will the wrong way, and ultimately was kind of the last straw, so that it really feels like they kind of lost Will in all of this. And ultimately it comes down to, a very un-Penske like situation where they've known, so long of thinking far ahead and parting ways with guys at the exact right time. When you look at going from 4 cars to 3 with Simon at a point where he was starting to show some signs of, just not maybe that peak championship contending level of execution that he had from 2016 through 2019, after I think 2 years of finishing 8th in the championship in 20 and 21. Montoya all of a sudden finishing 4th on the team, and Joseph happening to be available. All of these pieces had been lined up so well, and now they are in a position where the folks that are available, whether it's Renus or whether it's Malukas, both are in some ways still projects. Maybe Renus has a win, he has a pole, but still hasn't had the opportunity to be at a top team. But I don't think either of them are slam dunks when you talk about hopping into a Team Penske ride and just immediately definitely being at the level that Joseph Newgarden and McLaughlin are. I think they both could be, especially both could be in a couple years, but they don't feel like they're ready to go and hop into this Team Penske equipment and automatically go and win a championship like Joseph Newgarden did in 2017.
Yeah, and the thing that just at some point, you got to stop looking at the expiration date or thinking that there's an expiration date on drivers. Like sometimes, I don't care what the analytics say. When you look at this, one, it's also more about what else does he get? What does somebody like Will Power give you throughout the entire organization? But also, like, let's be completely honest. Even if he has or does lose a step, he's still one of the top 10, top 12 best drivers in the series, period. Like, how much are you really losing when you're looking at how close this series is? And to think about how he bolsters the rest of the lineup because of his information and his knowledge, it's just, yeah, it was absolutely poorly handled. And, I'm gonna say this right now. I think it's going to end up kind of like an Elio thing, where I know Elio did a bunch of one-offs while he was in the Penske sports car program following his full-time career. Elio went first Indy 500 with Meyer-Shank, first one without Penske, goes and wins his fourth Indy 500. I'm not going to go that far. I don't want to predict an Indy 500 winner, but I do think this. The one pole that has eluded Will Power his entire career is an Indy 500 pole, and it would not shock me in the slightest if he goes out there and rattles 4 crisp laps off and ends up taking pole in next year's 500 after that.
That sure would be something.
It's a hell of a statement, and there's something to be said for the fact that Elio was casted off in a very unique way. Obviously, there was still the sports car program. There still is a sports car program now, but obviously it doesn't necessarily build a wheel. So maybe he wasn't even extended that courtesy. I'm not entirely sure on that one, but
yeah, I think Porsche, the way in which that organization runs, I think as a factory program, Porsche has very much had the handle on who the drivers were, and I don't know that they necessarily were in the same position to offer Will something like that. And frankly, I don't think he would have taken it, especially with this Andretti opportunity out there.
No, for sure. And then the last bit that I'll say is that because I know we've kind of dogged a little bit on David Malukas because it's hard to fill that spot. It's hard. So the last thing that I'll say on this is that if it is David Malukas, if it is as predicted that they move him up, I sincerely hope that he's able to do well, because what he had to endure from just a casual mountain biking situation when he earned, and the key word there is earned, because he showed really well at Dale Coyne Racing based on the equipment, based on what they had, showed really well to earn an opportunity at a seat at Arrow McLaren. And misfortunate events, I mean, you could step off of a curb wrong and break your ankle, if we're being completely honest. So it was a very unfortunate situation that led to an even worse situation where one of the best rides you could have in this sport went away for him. Didn't even get a chance to do more than just test that car for that team. And to see what he's battled from, he's still working his way back. If there's a situation where he is moving into this, I mean, I can't think of a more pressure-packed situation than maybe driving the number 9 at Chip Ganassi Racing. So I genuinely hope he's able to go in there and do well, and frankly, carve out his own legacy, carve out his own good career in that, because what he has been through, but also what he is potentially entering, it's so colossal that I can't even imagine the pressures that come with it. So I personally hope that, there's an opportunity for him to, frankly, probably not listen to talking heads like us too much, and just go and do the job. But to shift gears, because we definitely need to touch on Colton. Test driver at Cadillac. We knew that there would be some scenario where he would be involved in the program in some way. He's finished, I think it was 7th in points. So just 2 spots off the mark of just needing one FP1 run, unfortunately, because of the stupid F1 grading system. And I'm sure Europeans might think that that's snobbish on my part, but I don't really care. But, at the end of the day, I would like to see him put in an F2 seat before the end of this season. I would like to see him run maybe 2 races, 3 races with the program by the end of this season in some form or fashion, just to have a little bit more understanding of things going into next year, so he's not completely on the back foot. I would like to see that materialize. Can that happen? I don't know. But you look at the fact that we end the season so early, right? There's got to be an opportunity, hopefully, to get him in there, and if nothing else, at least get a few tests in at the very least. So I'd be very fascinated to see how that can materialize. And you look at what the possibilities are, and what I'll say on this is the fact that you hit the nail on the head with this too. Is Colton has always wanted the F1 dream. He's always been fighting it. And the reality is, he can go over there and race for 5, 6, 7 years and come back to IndyCar and still be 30s and still potentially have a decade-long career chasing Indy 500s and championships and whatnot. So would it be nice if the stats were better before he's dipping off in F1 to have better representation? Yeah, and Colton would probably be the first to tell you, like, where he let certain wins get away and how things played out. I mean, there was more on the table that he wishes he could have taken advantage of, for sure, like anybody would, right? Like any competitor. So, and it's all learning moments. And frankly, this might be looked at by many as a spec type series, but not all teams are created equal. So I think he's going to go over there and nail it and do a really damn good job. I think the kicker is that I admire that no matter how much this process has taken twists and turns, and frankly, in some ways, the unwarranted negativity drawn his way on so many different levels, he's continued to not let that light, that dream dim. He's maintained course, and for one, to think that he could be potentially a year away from being on an F1 grid is awesome. And let's not forget, we've been trying so hard. F1 is not necessarily purposeful as far as for a lot of people, because it just seems so far-fetched and so far gone. But at one point, the North American open wheel scene had some level of synergy when it came to F1. It wasn't just F1 cast-offs coming over here. It wasn't people who had F1 careers coming over here. Let's not forget, Zanardi was a former F1 guy that came in the cart that went back into F1 briefly. There's Jacques Villeneuve comes to mind. You think back to the early 90s. There's certain levels of aspects that I look at this and think, man, maybe there's a way to rekindle a little bit of that pipeline. I'm not saying that I want IndyCar to be a funnel system to F1, but I certainly don't want it to become a barrier or a wall either. I would love to see a situation where, if the right circumstances can play out, it's not out of the realm of possibilities if that is a place you want to go.
Yeah. At least the overwhelming sentiment I felt like I saw from fans, and again, I know social media is not necessarily a great barometer for things like this, but I saw a lot of people, following this general discourse of how can Colton be jumping from IndyCar to Formula 2. And again, that's not confirmed, even though Dan Towriss said it was happening. We don't know what team he's going to be, but there are a lot of people upset with the idea that an IndyCar driver would jump down a series to go to Formula 2, or that Colton would leave his IndyCar career behind to go, definitely be a test driver in F1 and, lose the opportunity to win championships and 500s in IndyCar. Now, granted, next year's F2 schedule is completely clear in May. So does Colton come back and run the 500? I think that's something to watch out for. He even hinted in the podcast yesterday that that's something that I think very much could be an opportunity but ultimately it will come down to prioritizing his responsibilities first and foremost in, with Cadillac, even if there are no F2 races to run, if there are things he needs to be doing on the simulator or out testing at a TPC car or being at race weekends to help support the team, that's going to be the priority. And that's ultimately what he's going to be doing. So, we have to wait and see on that. But there are so many people, either fans of Colton's or just IndyCar fans in general, upset seeing a driver drop down to Formula 2 and what is clearly, from a stature standpoint, a lower competition wise series, a series that doesn't have the 500, a series where an F2 championship does not mean nearly as much as an IndyCar championship in the greater realm of motorsports. But what it comes down to, and Dan made a great point in his interview yesterday, is that this is what it takes. Yes, would it have looked better for Colton to finish 4th or 5th this year in IndyCar and earn the super license and be automatically qualified to go out there in 2026 and not have to jump down to F2? And does it look like, does it call into question the fact that he can't even earn the super license points in IndyCar? He has to go to Formula 2 to earn it. Yeah, but ultimately you can't change the way the system is set up. This is the way the system is set up. It is easier to go to Formula 2 and earn points to get his super license. Next year, all he has to do, if you don't even factor in the points that he could earn by doing several FP1s in F1 that make this even that much easier, ultimately he just has to go and finish 8th or 9th in Formula 2 in a 22 car grid. Is that automatic? No. But I think it's reasonable to expect that he will be able to do that. And yes, if he finishes 7th or 8th in F2 as a rookie, as a 26-year-old, is that going to are there going to be people out there that question his abilities and question therefore IndyCar drivers' abilities? Yes. But ultimately that will make him qualified, and it will be up to the folks at Cadillac, Graham Loudon, the team principal, Dan Towriss, the CEO of TWG Motorsports, to decide if Colton is ready. And if they feel like Colton is ready as soon as 2027 or in 2028, if he needs one more year, those are their decisions to make. I think even if Colton had gone and qualified for a super license by finishing 4th in the championship this year, I think this is a much better way to set him up for success than the idea of Cadillac, seeing that maybe he was on a track to finish 4th and get the super license and putting him in the car straight away, where so many of these tracks he has never raced on. And even the tracks that he has, it's been a decade or more. He's, having never raced on the Pirelli tire, at least in the last decade, not knowing, or, not having experienced the different ways in which this F2 car drives or this F1 car drives. He would have gone into, an F1 season in 2026 with so little time in the car. Sergio Perez will, he said last week when the drivers were formally announced that he will get to do some TPC testing, I presume, in a Ferrari, an old Ferrari car, just to kind of get a handle on things, not necessarily to have any idea what next year's car is going to feel like. I'm sure there'll be plenty of time for him in the sim, but Colton would have been coming into this so blind, and I think also would have had all these eyes and expectations on him. He's going to have that whether he gets to, whenever he does get to Formula One. But I think this is a better way in which to prepare himself for this. And ultimately, he's now in a very much sink or swim scenario. He is going to show Cadillac through, his sim work and his, time in meetings and all these other projects he can be involved with, and the feedback that he can give, as well as how he performs in Formula 2. His performance will ultimately determine whether he's ready for that. He could have earned a super license by getting the points in IndyCar, but I don't think he would have been as prepared as he will now be by going through this program that he's is going to be set up for him. I think he is someone who cares the absolute least about what other people think of him, and so I think mentally, he's not going to care one bit that people think he's taking a step down, and that he's running against a lot of teenagers and probably getting beat a bunch of weekends. He might only win a couple races, and yeah, it might be pretty strong for him to finish third or fourth in F2, and there are going to be so many people out there who, when he doesn't win, and if he doesn't win a championship, are going to knock him for that. And Colton is someone that I think is incredibly mentally strong and totally prepared for that, and is just focused on living out a dream. And so for the people who are fans of Colton, who are really disappointed in seeing him leave IndyCar, I think you have to respect him for going and chasing this dream. He's talked about it for a long time. Yes, I know there have been, in the last, say, 12 to 18 months, there have been times where he said that this would be a really hard decision for him to make and how much he loves IndyCar, but this is not him being forced into doing this. There are some people, I've seen that sentiment online that Cadillac and TWG, because they're paying him $7 million a year, that he's being forced to go and earn that money and at least give them a shot to put him in an F1 car because they've been paying him like a Formula One driver for several years. That team is not going to go through the process of shaping this platform and this program for Colton if this isn't something that Colton wants to do. I trust and know that he had every opportunity to stay in IndyCar if that's what he wanted to do, but this has been his dream for a long time. He went and spent 2 years in Europe as a teenager, living largely by himself, having to grow up, with a drop of a hat, and clearly did that. Finished, I think, top 3 in a couple championships, but ultimately didn't quite draw the attention that a driver like Lando Norris, who I think he competed with in that first year in Europe, did. And ultimately Lando moves on, and Colton's opportunity in Europe kind of sputtered out, and he came back and contended for a championship in what was then known as Indy Lights, and gets that opportunity with Harding in 2019, wins his third or fourth IndyCar start at Circuit of the Americas, and becomes the youngest driver ever to win a race in IndyCar, and things kind of take off from there. And he sets this course of 7 years in IndyCar, but he'd always still in the back of his mind had this desire to test himself in Formula One. I think he's set up, though he does not have the pedigree of some of those drivers that you mentioned that have gone from kart or IndyCar to F1 in the last 30 years or so. I looked back last week when I wrote a column, and all of those drivers had won championships over here. And so that's the way in which Colton has not yet, quote unquote, proven himself over here. Jacques had won a championship. Michael Andretti had won a championship. Sebastian Bourdais had won 4 championships. Alex Zanardi, obviously came over here from F1, won a championship, and went back. The list goes on and on. And Colton hasn't done that, but that doesn't mean he's not ready. I am of the belief that just because you aren't Alex Palou and haven't won 3 championships in a row and have that pedigree, I don't know that necessarily means that you aren't cut out for Formula One. I think it was Zach Brown that told us a couple years ago. This was right around when Colton was in the headlines for a potential opportunity at AlphaTauri at the end of 2022 for 2023. And Colton had done some testing for McLaren and was really the talk of that paddock, I think, in lots of ways in F1, about how strong of a talent he might be. And ultimately he didn't get that opportunity because of the super license system. I think it was Zach that told us he thought at the time that there were, probably the top half or so of the field could be and could reasonably be expected to hop into a decent ride in Formula One and be able to perform. Like, yes, no driver save maybe one or two in IndyCar, is going to go to a back marker team in F1 and take it to the midfield. But as we've seen, there, no team, Valtteri Bottas goes and finishes second in the championship in Mercedes, and a couple years later, he's in a Sauber and he's not getting any points. Do people think that Valtteri Bottas all of a sudden is just, a terrible driver? No, that championship is so much to do with the manufacturer and the car and the engine that you have underneath you. And so I don't think there's any reason, if Colton joins a somewhat midfield-ish Cadillac program in a year or a couple years, if they're able to get on the right trajectory, I don't think there's any reason why Colton's performance in IndyCar has anything to dictate what we think he should be capable of doing in Formula One.
Yeah, there's so much there that it's a different path, but also I think here's the other thing: what if, right? I mean, what if he goes to F2 and cleans up and wins 6, 7, 8 races and finishes first or second in the championship? I mean, Liberty Media is an American company. Cadillac's an American brand. The amount of buzz that would be built around that, in many ways, would help IndyCar on a very weird level.
Yeah, Colton's going to have the weight of IndyCar on his shoulders for the next couple of years. He's, we've had all this talk for so long about whether IndyCar drivers are cut out for Formula One or not. I'm sure he's going to, an IndyCar is not going to necessarily come off like this. Maybe they will. But he's going to have a lot of drivers cheering for him, drivers that he has beaten, or drivers that have finished right around him. If he can go and show out and beat these F2 drivers that a lot of people think he's not cut out for, I think that will show a lot and do a lot for IndyCar's stock in a lot of people's eyes. Yes, if he doesn't win the championship, there are going to be people saying, "Wow, your 2024 IndyCar runner-up finisher couldn't even win an F2 championship. What does that say about you?" But I don't think you're ever going to win those people over. And if he ultimately does get to F1 and he does have some solid results in a Cadillac car that is still trying to get up to speed, I think that will do a lot and maybe kind of finally help us have the end, hopefully, to this modern day discussion of whether there's more than one or two Indy drivers that could ever cut it out in Formula One. Because Colton did have that one year where he finished runner-up in the championship, but he's also had as many, if not more, years where he's finished 6th, 7th, 10th. And so if a guy like that can come into the right opportunity and have, run around the midfield, I think that will do a lot in raising the stock of what the IndyCar championship is and how deep this field is.
Yeah, and the last 2 points I'll make on this is, let's not forget, Indy cars don't have power steering. Every car in Europe does, because they like it that way, and we make it harder on ourselves in many ways. So in some ways, I think while the drivability would be different, I think honestly it might even be easier to handle. But for that reason alone, I don't want to get in too deep because there is so many things that are different on the parallels. But the one other thing I'll say is that Colton Herta 3 years ago, when some of this stuff was being stirred about, the talent was there, but I don't necessarily know if the mental side of things were there, the maturity was there, because when it wasn't really until Rossi left Andretti and then you saw Colton kind of forced into a leadership role. And we know how the first year was maybe a little choppy, but year 2, like year 3, like there's a certain level that it has come with the last few years, certain level of maturity that I look at and I'm like, this guy can handle a lot. This guy can handle everything. And I feel like this maturity level of Colton can go in there and frankly, kick ass. And you're right. He will have the weight of the paddock, but in some ways, kind of like someone like Pato, which is fitting that they both raced for that championship in Indy Lights. I look at them and I think that those are the guys that kind of embrace it. They embrace what it is to represent, effectively an entire paddock. And I mean, think about the field that they both of them have had to race against. Marcus Ericsson, former F1 guy, now Indy 500 winner, multi-time race winner in IndyCar. You look at Romain Grosjean coming over here. They've been okay. Fernando Alonso was here for that, twice and whatnot. But I mean, obviously Colton didn't necessarily race against him. But it's one of those that they're not exactly having the greatest. Like, they have some success. There's been some success. I'd say Marcus Ericsson has had by far the best success in recent years. So, flip the script a little bit, go over there, kick some ass, take some names, and represent well. And I'm rooting for Colton to do it. The last
and
bit,
I think the cool thing too, and what none of these guys that have done this leap before have had, Colton is he's leaving a seat that is ultimately owned and operated by TWG Motorsports to go to an F2 ride that I'm sure TWG is going to be paying for, to be a test driver for an F1 team that TWG Motorsports co-owns. And ultimately, if all of this stuff in Europe just doesn't go well for Colton, if Bottas and Perez, are lights out, and as they're having successes still want to stay at Cadillac, and Cadillac thinks it's best to hang on to them, and maybe Colton isn't adjusting as well, or for whatever reason this just doesn't go wrong, I have no doubt that there will always be an IndyCar seat at Andretti Global for Colton Herta if this ultimately doesn't go well and he's back here looking for a ride in a couple of years. Michael Andretti leaves Newman Haas, where he won a championship. He wins the championship there in 91, leaves after the 92 season and goes to Formula One in 93. And by 94, that ride is not available anymore. And so he comes back to Chip Ganassi Racing. I think he maybe wins his first race back, but that seat was no longer available. Sebastian Bourdais leaves after 4 straight championships with Newman Haas at the very end of the Champ Car era, goes to Toro Rosso, which is now, then became AlphaTauri, which is now Racing Bulls. And after that season and a half kind of go awry when they ultimately choose a different Sebastian Vettel, he comes back here and the sport has changed so much, and there's no longer a championship caliber ride left for him. Colton, I think, will always have this opportunity. I really don't think there's a whole lot of risk. I've been telling people too that, for better or worse, Colton is in kind of a different place than Alex Palou, who I know we continue to have these conversations every so often about him and the possibility of going to Formula One. And I look at Colton as someone who, unfortunately, hasn't won a championship, hasn't yet won a 500. And he's kind of at this crossroads in his career where what is he losing? Giving maybe, but he also hasn't really challenged for one in his career. He's never gone into the last race having, being in championship contention. And I don't necessarily know that he would have gone into that next year. And so I look at it as, maybe in best case scenario, maybe Colton could have gone on a tear and go and win a couple championships in the span of the next couple of years. But I don't think that was a surefire thing. And I do think
he'll come back when the new car, like if
he can
come back with a new car, and
he's 25 right now. He could go and spend 4 years in Europe and be back here before he turns 30 and still have 10, 12, 15 years racing an IndyCar in front of him. Yes, his career totals will always lack what he could have done in those couple of years, but I don't know that Colton Herta, on the trajectory he's on right now, is necessarily going to be in contention to have the most poles in IndyCar history, or have the most wins in IndyCar history, or have the most championships in IndyCar history. And I have to think if he's ultimately someone who should win a championship, it will happen at some point. You can't be as confident about the 500 because we know there's so much variability in that. But I just don't look at Colton being in a position where he's giving up as much as, say, Alex Palou might be if he goes and leaves IndyCar right now for an F1 opportunity. If, and say he spends 2 or 3 years over there and it ultimately isn't really going anywhere, and so he decides that he wants to come back here. I mean, those very well could be 3 more championships he could have had, and maybe one other 500. And all of a sudden his career looks and feels very differently. And he's also 3 years older than Colton is. So I just look at Colton and feel like this is a perfect opportunity for him, in the support that he has going over there, and the support he would have coming back here if that's where this all ends up. And I really applaud him for taking some risks. I texted with some IndyCar drivers yesterday, and so many of them, I kept hearing the same thing. Like, none of us got to the places that we did in our careers without taking risks. This sport is not about playing things safe. You don't win races, you don't win championships, you don't win 500s. You certainly don't get an F1 seat by taking the easy road. And so I think there's a lot of support in the way in which Colton's gone about this, and the fact that he's fighting for what he wants.
There's 2 more things before we put a bow on this episode that I think are an impact of the silly season. One silly season thing that we do know that from this week that we definitely need to just briefly touch on is Rinus VeeKay shared his 1 year at Dale Coyne Racing, where early in the season started really good and got that podium in Toronto midsummer, and it kind of tapered off, obviously, the last handful of races. But he will not be back at Dale Coyne Racing. Kind of confirmed that. Was very appreciative to the team and the learnings and everything. I thought maybe there was a small chance he could come back, because him and Michael Cannon seemed to hit on some things really well. But where this kind of loops in is this. The complexity, let's see if we can follow along on the breadcrumb trail. With Colton leaving and Will going to Colton's seat, this now leaves all 3 seats at Andretti completely full. So Rinus cannot go there. There's chatter that he could end up in David Malukas' seat at AJ Foyt Racing while David goes and gets promoted to Team Penske. But the other end of this, and we've got an Indy Next champion who's in the Andretti umbrella, and Dennis Hauger, who has no seat to go to at the table of an Andretti seat for next year. And I know that there's been some chatter that maybe he could get loaned out, a la Kyle Kirkwood did with AJ Foyt Racing. And maybe we could see a situation where Dennis Hauger maybe takes the seat that was occupied by Rinus VeeKay, which would make sense from a manufacturer standpoint. We know that that's not necessarily a big hurdle for Andretti, because when they did that with AJ Foyt Racing, obviously a Chevy team, and Andretti a Honda. So this is just a brief little bit to touch on before we wrap up. Is Rinus VeeKay's not coming back? Dennis Hauger, your Indy Next champion, where does he go?
When I look at that decision from Rinus, I spoke to a couple of people on the ground in Nashville, and that ceremony that was held Friday morning in downtown Nashville with Dale Coyne Racing and Todd Alt, and kind of the presentation of the fact that Alt blockchain is going to be the primary sponsor in some way, shape, or form on both of these Dale Coyne Racing entries for 2026. I was told that up until a couple days before that had all the expectations of being a place where they were going to announce that Rinus was coming back next year. And then those talks kind of sputtered out. And I assumed, partially because we didn't know the stuff with Colton that could lead to, Will getting to go to Andretti, and what that all might lead to. I had long looked at the chessboard, if you will, and just assumed that for Rinus, staying at Dale Coyne Racing was going to be the best thing for him ultimately. He and his manager Adrian Sussman have said in recent weeks that ultimately what Rinus does for 2026 is predicated on positioning him best for his long-term future. And so if you read between the lines there, that is, I'm either going to find somewhere that will take me for 1 year, ideally somewhere where I can continue to show out and have some strong results and ready myself for what we expect to be this crazy 2026 silly season. Or, if the opportunity presents itself, land somewhere like an Andretti seat or a Penske seat. That's the best that I could hope for in my future. We don't think that those opportunities are out there. And so I initially assumed, he goes and finishes 12th or 13th in the championship, or maybe it was 14th, but still a really solid campaign for a Dale Coyne Racing driver. I think it was 14th, and had that podium, had a handful of top tens, and as you assume that Michael Cannon is coming back, Dale Coyne told us on Friday he believed that would be the case. There would be no reason to think that team would not just continue to find some synergy and have another solid season there in 2026. So the fact that Rinus didn't just say he wasn't ready to sign yet, but that he has informed the team that there is, under no circumstances he coming back, that tells me that he has a better option on the table where he thinks he can perform better in 2026. And I don't think there are too many of those out there. And that's why I think that Foyt is where he is tipped to head. There are ultimately seats there's one seat at Foyt, assuming that Malukas leaves. There are 2 seats at Dale Coyne Racing, and there are a seat or 2, depending on who you talk to, at Juncos Hollinger Racing. And that, I believe, is the only open seats that we have out there. So I don't think you're leaving a seat at Coyne, even though one of its drivers, Jacob Abel, finished last in points by a long shot. I don't think you're jumping to, at best, I think leaving Coyne and going to Juncos is a lateral move. And I think a lot of people would say it's probably slightly a step down when you have Michael Cannon in the picture. So I don't understand why he would be leaving Coyne to go to Juncos. And so the only reasonable expectation is that he's headed to Foyt, where not only you have an opportunity to, David finished 12th in the championship there, I think 11th or 12th this year. Santino finished in the top 10 in points last year. He fell a couple spots this year, but had a tough end of the season. And so maybe that's an opportunity where he can shine even a little bit more next season, but it's also an opportunity to, if things really go off the rails, if, say, Joseph Newgarden leaves that organization after next year, or even a year after that, Rinus aligning himself with AJ Foyt Racing gives them an opportunity to have a bit tighter microscope on him and see what he can do, see what his feedback is like, get to hear from engineers about what he's like in and out of the cockpit. And potentially, if something opens up at Team Penske, you could very much see him in the catbird seat for an opportunity like that. And so if that is how it plays out, I don't necessarily blame Rinus, but that's the only way in which I see this all going. And then if that is the case, you have 2 seats at Coyne and 1 or 2 seats at Juncos, assuming that there's nothing else crazy that happens. And you've got drivers like Romain Grosjean, Dennis Hauger, Linus Lundqvist, Connor Daly, Stingray Robb, the incumbent drivers at Juncos, Kyle Collette, who finished runner-up in the Indy Next Championship this year. Still Jacob Abel floating out there, presumably with some solid funding to bring, although it was, I know, a very underwhelming rookie season for him. And those are kind of your players in the rest of this silly season, along with the fact that we still need to learn whether Prema is going to continue to operate as is, whether they merge with a team like Juncos or whether they just go away completely. That would be a big blow and kind of a change to this landscape. And then maybe at that point you have drivers like Callum Eilert or Robert Schwartzman on the table, though I don't ultimately know if that will all get set before some of these seats are kind of locked up and finalized.
Yeah, it's going to be incredibly crazy. And like you, just kind of forecasting it, I can't see a situation where VK turns down an opportunity that frankly, I mean, he loved racing with Dale Coyne.
Yes.
Like talking to him a couple of times throughout the season, like just the amount of love that he has for them and what they did for his career and how they made it fun for him in many ways. So hopefully some of that synergy can can be built into his next step, presumably at AJ Foyt Racing. So
I'll ask you this: we laid out all the seats out there. How do you, if you were betting today, how do you feel like these lineups ultimately line up with AJ Foyt Racing, Dale Coyne Racing, and Juncos for next year?
Assuming that Prema stays.
Sure. Yeah, let's make that assumption. Let's say that they find a way to stay on the grid.
Yeah, because I've heard some things on that one, and I'm kind of fascinated to see if certain things materialize. There's going to be something big on the Prema front if it materializes. So I do think that Will forced Penske's hand to move David up, because you don't necessarily have a veteran just running loose that you probably feel comfortable with plugging in that car for 1 year. To be fair, you could make the argument that maybe VK should jump Malukas for that seat and you leave Malukas in the 4. I don't think that'll happen, just for the sake of, being in the program and whatnot. So I do very much think that it's probably Malukas jumping to Penske, VK jumping to the 4 alongside Ferrucci. And then you asked about Juncos, I believe, right?
Just who do you ultimately see slotting into those 2 seats at Juncos and the 2 seats at Coyne next year?
I think Stingray's going to be back. I think there's just so much funding behind that effort that I think Stingray, I honestly, I don't even think he is on a 1-year deal. I think it was a multi. So
I don't think so either, but that multi-year deal had been the way it always been portrayed to me. But, one of those things where, ultimately contracts are worth the paper that they're signed on and not a whole lot else.
Yeah, right. So I do think it's Stingray in one of the seats. I would like to see Connor back. I wonder if he'll end up in an Indy only entry when it's all said and done in some respects, or if there's going to be something where they try to split it and try to get more funding to the program for maybe the road and streets and have Connor run ovals only. I do think that's a possibility. I think anything's on the table with that second seat. And I mean, for that, they almost landed Louis Foster a year ago. They were really close, and it didn't happen. Obviously, we know he ended up at RLL. I look at a situation like that and think, is this where a KO Collette can land in some respects? I think Colette's ready for the next step. There's so many things that he does, and I've said this to numerous people. There's so many little things, and also things that I've heard that he does in the engineering debriefs and post-practice and qualifying debriefs. There's so much there that reminds me of the late Gilles DeFerrin. And the mannerisms, the style of driver he is, the way that he goes through the notes. I remember talking to Mike Marini from HMD, the president over there, and he just told me how KO Collette is in some of the debriefs. And I'm like, wow, like those are so many things that I've heard about from so many people related to Gilles. And so I personally would love to see Collette at the top level, and I think that could be the most likely destination for that. And then for Coyne, I think that's where a Dennis Hauger loan year comes into play. And then assuming the second seat's a full-time seat.
Yeah, and it appears that it's a funded seat too, which I think is really important in all of this.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that could be the best case scenario for Connor, to be blunt. I mean, a full-time funded seat, but I don't think there's a good relationship there with who's backing it.
Yes.
So I don't know if that's going to happen. Who else are we forgetting here on?
I think the Coyne lineup next year is Romain and Dennis Hauger.
I could go with that. Yeah, I was kind of leaning on Linus, but I could go. There's a good rapport with Romain and Dale Coyne, and he wants back in from according to some of the stuff that I've read out there. So, we really got to figure out a way to get Linus Lundqvist back in the series.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's the tough thing is that, like, if at a seat where the ride is funded, do you pick Roma, who has great track record with Dale, a great relationship with Dale, or do you pick someone like Linus, who really only had that one season at Ganassi, and he had some great moments, but also had some ups and downs, and who do you side with there? And then if Linus is factoring in over at a place like Juncos, that's a place that really would like to have money. Ultimately, I don't know if that's completely the deciding factor. They also want to be competitive too. And so I get the sense that like maybe you've got Stingray, assuming he comes back, and then you kind of got this, this trio of drivers between Connor and Kyle Collette and Linus. I know Kaio has some backers. How much money can they bring to the table? Connor is always someone who's scheming, bringing sponsors together. He showed that multiple times this year, but ultimately, how much money can he bring to the table? How much does that team value what he can do on ovals? Is someone like Linus that doesn't seem like he comes with any funding? Is he someone that is a young, somewhat pretty promising talent in what he's shown? Is he someone that you're willing to put in the car without bringing any funding to the table? I think there are a lot of big questions on what that last Juncos seat could be that I feel a lot less certain about than I feel like I do just about all the other openings.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think the big question marks for me are where, like we just touched on a little bit of, I think it's going to be a revolving door, or not even a revolving door, a race between three drivers to land space. And it's going to be Collette, Linus, and probably Daly. Roman, maybe, but I mean, Roma's kind of just always had the same things towards the series. There's only X amount of funding that he's going to be able to, that he will probably push to raise or anything like that, because there is a certain value that he brings to a team already. Everybody else is in a little bit of a different boat.
So that's where we will leave this episode now, rounding out all the silly season nuggets as they stand. As I look at my clock at 11:58 a.m. on Thursday morning, if you're listening to this later, maybe more things have worked their way out. If you haven't yet listened to it yet, we will actually have another episode coming out this week, just kind of breaking down the results from Nashville Super Speedway, as well as the way the championship standings panned out. Obviously, we knew going in who first and second were, but I think there are some interesting conversations to be had about that, as well as where the table sits as of now. Entering Thursday afternoon on the 2026 schedule that still is yet to be released, and some of the last question marks that we have there. So encourage you folks to give that episode a listen as well. Like and subscribe to our podcast. Again, you can listen to this on Apple and Spotify, on YouTube for the video element, as well as IndyStar.com. We appreciate you guys for supporting us and listening to us, interacting with us on social media throughout the season. We've really enjoyed this podcast. I've really enjoyed having Joey on as co-host, and we look forward to what this can continue to be into this off season and hopefully into next year as well. So with that, we'll end this episode here. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Inside Line.